April 13th, 1953. 2:17 a.m. Georgetown University Hospital, Washington, D.C. The fluorescent lights in the psychiatric ward hummed with a frequency that made Dr. Harold Abramson's fillings ache. Outside, Georgetown slept under a cold drizzle. The rain turned the Potomac River into hammered pewter. Inside room 3B, a man who should not exist was dying. Frank Olson, a biochemist and father of three, was a specialist in aerosol delivery systems. He worked for the United States Army's Special Operations Division. Olson lay strapped to a gurney. His pupils were dilated to black moons. His hospital gown clung to his chest, soaked through with sweat. This was despite the April chill seeping through the window seals. Every few minutes his body would arch against the restraints. He would scream something about villages, clouds, and the men with no faces. Dr. Abramson checked his watch again. It was a pullover his wife had given him for their anniversary. Its second hand swept past the 12 with relentless precision. 73 hours had passed since Olson had gone through the window of the Hotel Statler's 13th floor. It had also been 73 hours since the dosing at Deep Creek Lodge. The lysergic acid diethylamide should have metabolized by now. All of it should have metabolized. However, Olson kept screaming about things he should not remember. In Abramson's breast pocket, folded into a tight square, was a telegram. It came from a number that did not officially exist. The message contained only 6 words. Patient must not communicate. Terminate observation protocol. The paper felt heavier than it should. It pressed against his sternum, through the cotton of his shirt. Through the reinforced glass of the observation window, Abramson saw 2 men in dark suits. They stood in the corridor. These were not hospital security. Their overcoats were too well tailored. Their shoes were too expensive. They were certainly from the Central Intelligence Agency. Perhaps they were from the Office of Security. They might even be from somewhere deeper in the organisational chart. Some divisions had budget line items simply marked Studies and Observations. Olson's vital signs were failing. His blood pressure was dropping. His respiratory rate was climbing. The physical trauma from the fall was catastrophic. He had a ruptured spleen, a fractured skull, and internal hemorrhaging. No amount of surgery could repair these injuries. He would die before dawn. Everyone in the room knew this. But the question made Abramson's hands tremble as he adjusted the morphine drip. It was simpler and more terrible. How much did he remember? How much did he tell the police before they reached him? Outside, the rain intensified. It drummed against the window like fingertips trying to get in. The official story remained consistent for 22 years. On November 28, 1953, during Thanksgiving weekend, Dr. Frank Olson fell to his death. He was a civilian scientist employed at Fort Detrick, Maryland. Olson fell from the 13th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York City. The New York Police Department ruled it a suicide. Colleagues described Olson as having suffered a nervous breakdown following a work retreat. His widow, Alice Olson, was told her husband had been under psychiatric care for depression. She received his life insurance payout. The Army sent a letter of condolence. The file was then closed. What the file did not mention was that Frank Olson had spent the previous 9 days in an increasingly paranoid spiral. This began after he was secretly dosed with lysergic acid diethylamide during a Central Intelligence Agency retreat. The file also did not mention that the dosing was part of a program called MKUltra. Furthermore, it did not mention that the retreat at Deep Creek Lodge in Western Maryland was attended by men from the Central Intelligence Agency's technical services staff. These specialists focused on chemical interrogation, biological warfare, and what the agency delicately called special operations affecting the mind. And it certainly did not mention that Frank Olson had not jumped from that window. He had been pushed. However, in 1953, none of this was public knowledge. MKUltra itself would not be exposed until 1975. A church committee investigation then revealed 2 decades of operational security breaches. For 22 years, the Olson case was simply a tragic footnote. It remained in the personnel records of the United States Army's Special Operations Division. It was a sad story about a scientist who could not handle the pressure of classified work. The truth was far more complex and infinitely darker. MKUltra began officially on April 13, 1953. This was exactly 7 months before Frank Olson's death. It operated under the authorization of Central Intelligence Agency Director Alan Dulles. The program's mandate was breathtaking in its scope. It aimed to develop techniques for mind control, memory manipulation, and behavioral modification. These methods involved chemical, biological, and psychological means. Its budget was classified. Its operations were compartmentalized. Fewer than 24 people in the entire United States government knew of its existence. Dr. Sidney Gottlieb ran MKUltra. He was the Central Intelligence Agency's chief of the chemical division of the technical services staff. Gottlieb was a brilliant chemist with a doctoral degree from California Institute of Technology. A clubfoot had kept him out of World War II combat. Colleagues described him as soft-spoken and almost professorial. He kept a garden at his home in Virginia and raised goats. However, he was also responsible for some of the most ruthless human experiments ever conducted by the American intelligence community. Gottlieb's mandate came directly from the top of the Central Intelligence Agency's leadership. In 1953, the agency was terrified. American prisoners of war returning from Korea exhibited strange behaviors. They confessed to war crimes they had not committed. They denounced capitalism and praised Mao Zedong. Intelligence reports suggested the Chinese and Soviets had developed sophisticated brainwashing techniques. The Central Intelligence Agency believed the communists had leaped ahead in the science of mind control. They were wrong. Soviet and Chinese interrogation methods relied primarily on physical torture, sleep deprivation, and prolonged isolation. These were brutal but fundamentally traditional methods. However, the Central Intelligence Agency's misperception of a mind control gap drove the creation of MKUltra. This was done with the same urgency that would later fuel the space race and the missile gap. The program eventually included 149 sub-projects, a vast undertaking. These involved experiments with lysergic acid diethylamide, mescaline, barbiturates, and amphetamines. Heroin and dozens of other psychoactive compounds were also used. The methods involved hypnosis, sensory deprivation, electroshock therapy, and surgical brain modification. Test subjects included Central Intelligence Agency officers who sometimes volunteered. Prison inmates, however, did not volunteer. Mental patients could not consent. Ordinary citizens were dosed without their knowledge in what the agency called natural settings. These included bars, restaurants, and brothels operated by Central Intelligence Agency paid madams. The goal was both offensive and defensive. Offensively, the Central Intelligence Agency wanted drugs that could force enemy agents to reveal secrets. They also wanted drugs that could erase memories of sensitive operations. Furthermore, they aimed to turn a captured asset into a programmable weapon. Defensively, they wanted to understand these techniques. This would allow American personnel to resist them. Frank Olson worked at Fort Detrick, the United States Army's biological warfare research facility in Maryland. His specialty was aerosol technology, focusing on how to disperse biological agents through the air. He had worked on anthrax, tularemia, and brucellosis. He had helped develop delivery systems for pathogens that could kill thousands. His security clearance was among the highest in the biowarfare program. He was exactly the kind of person Sidney Gottlieb needed for MKUltra. What Frank Olson did not know, on the morning of November 19, 1953, was that he had already been selected for something. The retreat at Deep Creek Lodge was presented as a working conference. It was a chance for technical services staff officers and Fort Detrick scientists to discuss operational coordination. This was done away from the constraints of official facilities. The lodge was remote, hidden in the Appalachian foothills of western Maryland. It was accessible only by a gravel road that wound through bare November woods. Olson arrived with 8 other Fort Detrick scientists. Sidney Gottlieb and several Central Intelligence Agency officers from the technical services staff were also present. This group included Robert Lashbrook, a chemist who served as Gottlieb's deputy. The lodge was rustic with wood-panelled walls and a stone fireplace. It smelled of pine and wood smoke. Outside, the temperature hovered just above freezing. Inside, the men wore wool sweaters and drank coffee from thermos bottles. On the evening of November the 19th, after dinner, Gottlieb prepared an after-dinner drink. He served Cointreau in small glasses. He then added approximately 70 micrograms of lysergic acid diethylamide to the bottle. This was a standard dose according to the protocols MKUltra had established. Then he served the drinks. 20 minutes later, Gottlieb informed the group that they had been dosed with lysergic acid diethylamide. This information comes from declassified Central Intelligence Agency documents. These include the Inspector General's 1963 report on MKUltra. This report was partially released in 1975 and more fully in 2001. The reaction was not uniform. Some men laughed. Others became quiet. Frank Olson became terrified. Lysergic acid diethylamide was still poorly understood in 1953. Albert Hofmann had synthesized it at Sandoz Pharmaceuticals in Switzerland in 1938. The Central Intelligence Agency had been experimenting with it since 1951. This was when the agency purchased its entire supply from Sandoz. The drug's effects were profound and unpredictable. They included visual distortions, time dilation, ego dissolution, and paranoia. Mystical experiences and complete psychotic breaks could also occur. The duration was 8 to 12 hours. There was no antidote. For Frank Olson, the experience was catastrophic. Over the following days at Deep Creek Lodge, Olson became increasingly agitated. He expressed fears that someone was trying to harm him. He spoke about wanting to quit his job. Declassified documents indicate he stated he felt terrible guilt and had made a mistake. The nature of this guilt would become central to understanding what happened next. Frank Olson knew terrible things. In 1953, the United States biowarfare program was conducting experiments. These violated every principle of medical ethics and international law. Olson had travelled to Porton Down, the United Kingdom's chemical warfare research facility. He had been briefed on Central Intelligence Agency operations in Europe. There is substantial evidence, though still partially classified, that Olson knew of American experiments. These involved biological weapons testing on unwitting populations. He possibly also knew of Central Intelligence Agency interrogation techniques that amounted to torture and murder. Specifically, declassified documents and testimony from Olson's colleagues suggest he may have witnessed interrogations in Europe. During these, prisoners were dosed with chemical agents. They were then subjected to extreme hypothermia. These experiments resulted in deaths. He may have known about Operation Artichoke, the Central Intelligence Agency's predecessor program to MKUltra. This involved terminal medical experiments on suspected double agents. The lysergic acid diethylamide had unlocked something in his conscience. By November 24, 5 days after the dosing, Olson's condition had deteriorated. Sidney Gottlieb and Robert Lashbrook decided to take him to New York City. They aimed to see Dr. Harold Abramson. Dr. Abramson was a physician, secretly on the Central Intelligence Agency payroll. His specialty was lysergic acid diethylamide research. He was running his own MKUltra sub-project, examining the drug's effects. They checked into the Hotel Statler in Midtown Manhattan. Their room was 1018A. This was on the 10th floor, not the 13th. That detail would be one of many the official story would get wrong. For 3 days, Abramson attempted to treat Olson's worsening paranoia, but Olson's statements became more specific and more dangerous. According to Central Intelligence Agency documents, he expressed intentions to resign from his position. He also indicated he wanted to talk about his work. In the language of 1953 Cold War intelligence operations, this meant Frank Olson had become a security risk. On November the 27th, Robert Lashbrook made a phone call to Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. The details of that conversation remain classified. Later that night, Lashbrook and Olson checked out of the Hotel Statler. They then checked into a different room. This was room 1018A. However, hotel records recently uncovered by researcher 8P Albarelli Jr. revealed irregularities in the registration. Signatures did not match. There were timing discrepancies. Evidence suggested other individuals may have accessed the room. At 2:30 in the morning on November the 28th, 1953, Frank Olson went through the window. Robert Lashbrook was in the room when this happened. His account to the police was brief. Olson had suddenly jumped from the bed. He ran across the room. He crashed through the closed window. He fell 10 stories to the sidewalk below. Lashbrook stated that he did not have time to stop Olson. However, the physical evidence told a different story. The window was not merely broken. It was shattered outward with considerable force. This suggested impact from a running start or a thrown object. However, the window was located approximately 14 feet from the bed where Olson had supposedly been sleeping. To build sufficient momentum to break through a closed hotel window, Olson would have needed to achieve a running speed. This speed would be impossible in that distance. He would also need to break through the heavy blinds that covered the window. Moreover, Olson's body landed unusually far from the building's base. It was approximately 10 feet from the foundation. Forensic analysis conducted decades later suggested this trajectory was more consistent with being pushed or thrown than with a simple fall. There was also the matter of the pullover watch. When police arrived at the scene, they found Olson's body on the sidewalk. His watch, a stainless steel pullover with a leather band, had stopped at exactly 2:28 in the morning. However, hotel staff reported hearing the sound of breaking glass closer to 2:30 in the morning. Lashbrook's call to the front desk came at 2:31 in the morning. The 2-minute gap would haunt investigators for decades. The immediate aftermath was clinically efficient. Within hours of Olson's death, Central Intelligence Agency officers arrived at the Hotel Statler. They spoke to the New York Police Department detectives handling the case. Security credentials were shown. These indicated that this was a matter of national security. The investigation was quickly shut down. The death was ruled a suicide. The medical examiner's report was brief and conclusive. Alice Olson received a phone call at her home in Frederick, Maryland. She was told her husband had died in a fall in New York City. She was not told about the drug LSD. She was not told about the program known as MKUltra. She was not told that Robert Lashbrook had been in the room. The Central Intelligence Agency sent a representative to the funeral. He expressed condolences. He explained that Frank Olson had been under severe stress from his classified work. There were implications, never stated directly, that Olson had been mentally unstable. This implied that the pressure of handling deadly pathogens had broken something in him. Alice Olson accepted the Army's life insurance payout. She raised her 3 children, Eric, Lisa, and Nils, alone. She kept her husband's belongings in a trunk in the attic. She did not speak much about how he died. For Sidney Gottlieb, the Olson case was a problem, but not a crisis. He filed a report with the Central Intelligence Agency's Inspector General. This report was later classified as document number 163,534. The report acknowledged that the LSD dosing had caused Olson's mental breakdown. However, it characterised this as an unfortunate accident during legitimate testing. The report recommended that future LSD experiments be conducted with more careful subject selection and improved medical monitoring. The MKUltra program continued. Over the next 2 decades, the program expanded dramatically. Gottlieb's budget grew into the millions of dollars. Safe houses were established in San Francisco and New York. There, prostitutes paid by the Central Intelligence Agency would dose unsuspecting clients. Agency officers watched these activities through 2-way mirrors. Mental patients at institutions across the country were subjected to weeks-long LSD trips. Researchers monitored them for signs of memory erasure or personality change. Prison inmates were given LSD for 77 consecutive days. This was to see if prolonged exposure would break down psychological defences. The results were generally disappointing from an intelligence standpoint. LSD did not create Manchurian candidates. It did not reliably erase memories. It did not make people more suggestible or more compliant. However, it did cause profound psychological trauma. It triggered lasting mental illness. It also occasionally killed people. However, the Olson case had taught the Central Intelligence Agency an important operational lesson. Deniability was essential. After 1953, MKUltra's paper trail became more carefully sanitized. Experiments were documented using code words. Test subjects were referred to by number, not name. When projects failed or produced dangerous outcomes, records were destroyed. The Bulova watch was among Frank Olson's effects. It was returned to his widow along with his wallet, his wedding ring, and the clothes he had been wearing. The watch remained in a box in the Olson family attic for 22 years. Alice Olson would sometimes take it out and wind it. It still kept perfect time. In Moscow, the KGB maintained extensive files on American biological warfare programs. Soviet intelligence had penetrated Fort Detrick. They also had informants in the Central Intelligence Agency. They knew about MKUltra, though not in full detail. However, they knew enough to understand its general contours. The KGB's own mind control programs were conducted under the banner of special psychiatry. These programs were equally brutal and equally ineffective. Both sides were fumbling in the dark. They were convinced the enemy had achieved breakthroughs that did not exist. They raced to develop weapons that could not be built. The Cold War's technological competitions often followed this pattern. Mirror image paranoia drove parallel programs toward impossible goals. In Washington, however, the secret held. Through the 1950s and 1960s, MKUltra expanded. It then began to wind down. The program was officially terminated in 1973. However, some activities continued under different program names. Frank Olson remained a classified footnote. His name appeared in no public document. His death was never investigated beyond the initial police report. The Bulova watch continued ticking in the attic box. It marked time that Frank Olson no longer had. The turning point came in 1975. It came from an unexpected direction. On December 22, 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh published a bombshell article in the New York Times. The article, headlined, "Huge Central Intelligence Agency Operation Reported in the United States Against Anti-War Forces and Other Dissidents in Nixon Years, Detailed Illegal Domestic Surveillance Operations." These were conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency in violation of its charter. The revelations sparked a political firestorm. In response, President Gerald Ford created the United States President's Commission on Central Intelligence Agency Activities within the United States. This commission was popularly known as the Rockefeller Commission, named after its chairman, Vice President Nelson Rockefeller. The commission was tasked with investigating the Central Intelligence Agency's domestic operations. It aimed to determine the extent of illegal activity. As the commission's investigators dug through decades of classified files, they stumbled onto references to MKUltra. The references were fragmentary. Most MKUltra documents had been destroyed in 1973 on orders from Central Intelligence Agency Director Richard Helms. However, enough survived to indicate the program's existence and general scope. Buried in those surviving fragments was a reference to an incident in November 1953. It involved the death of an army scientist following an LSD dosing. On June 10, 1975, the Rockefeller Commission released its report. On page 225, in a section titled Testing of Drugs on Unsuspecting Persons, the report described the Olson case. It did not, however, use his name. It stated that a government scientist had died after being secretly given LSD during a Central Intelligence Agency experiment. The dosing had triggered a severe psychological reaction. The scientist had subsequently committed suicide. The report recommended that the scientist's family be located. They should be informed of the true circumstances surrounding the death. On July 21, 1975, the Washington Post identified the scientist as Frank Olson. The phone rang in Frederick, Maryland. Alice Olson answered. A reporter asked if she had known her husband had been given LSD by the Central Intelligence Agency. She had not known this. The Belova watch was still in the attic. It was still keeping time. For Eric Olson, Frank's eldest son, the revelation was transformative and devastating. He had been 9 years old when his father died. His entire understanding of his father's death had been built on a lie. His entire childhood, really, had been based on a falsehood. The suicide story, the nervous breakdown, the implication of mental weakness, all of it was fabrications. Eric demanded answers. He contacted journalists, attorneys, and members of Congress. He discovered that his father's death had been briefly mentioned in classified Central Intelligence Agency documents. These documents had survived the 1973 purge. He found Robert Lashbrook, the Central Intelligence Agency officer who had been in the hotel room. Eric confronted him. Lashbrook, by then retired, refused to discuss details. He cited national security classifications. In July 1975, President Ford invited the Olson family to the White House. It was a surreal scene. The President of the United States offered a formal apology to the widow and children of a man killed by the Central Intelligence Agency 22 years earlier. Ford expressed his deep regret. He authorized a settlement payment of $750,000 to the family. Central Intelligence Agency Director William Colby personally apologized. He told the Olsons that Frank Olson's death was a tragic result of a well-intentioned but misguided experiment. He stated that procedures had been changed to prevent similar incidents. He also said that the agency had learned from its mistakes. What Colby did not tell them was that the Central Intelligence Agency still classified Frank Olson's death as suicide. He did not mention the growing concerns among some agency officers. They feared the Olson case might involve something more sinister than an accidental LSD dosing. Colby also did not disclose that portions of the Olson file remained classified. These were at levels even above his own security clearance. The files were locked away in compartments. Their existence was known only to a handful of officers in the counterintelligence staff. The Olsons accepted the apology. They accepted the settlement. However, Eric Olson did not stop asking questions. Over the following decades, he became an investigator of his own father's death. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He filed dozens of them. He tracked down former Central Intelligence Agency officers and Fort Detrick scientists who had known his father. He hired forensic experts to review the evidence. He read everything he could find about MKUltra. He studied the Cold War biowarfare programs. He also learned about Central Intelligence Agency interrogation techniques. Slowly, a different picture began to emerge. Documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests revealed that Frank Olson had travelled to Europe in the summer of 1953. This was just months before his death. He had visited Porton Down in England. He had also visited agency safe houses in Germany where interrogations were conducted. Declassified cables indicated that Olson had expressed concerns about what he had witnessed. These concerns were serious enough to be documented. They appeared in communications between Central Intelligence Agency stations and headquarters. In 2001, Eric Olson had his father's body exhumed. The coffin was opened. Frank Olson's remains were remarkably preserved by the embalming process. James Starrs, a professor of forensic science at George Washington University, examined them. Starrs' findings were explosive. The skull showed evidence of a blunt force trauma to the left temple. This injury occurred before the fall, not as a result of it. The injury pattern was consistent with being struck by a hard object, possibly a hammer or club. Starrs concluded that the forensic evidence strongly suggested homicide. Moreover, the Central Intelligence Agency's own 1953 assassination manual was declassified in 1997. This occurred as part of a document release on Guatemala operations. It contained specific instructions for staged defenestrations. The manual was titled A Study of Assassination. It was prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency's Technical Services staff, Sidney Gottlieb's division. The manual recommended the most efficient accident for a simple assassination. This involved a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. It stated that the act could be executed by a sudden, vigorous upward movement of the ankles. This would tip the subject over the edge. The Bulova watch had been returned to Eric Olson, along with the other effects from the exhumation. It no longer ran. Decades in the ground had finally stopped it. However, its hands still pointed to 228. The revelation that Frank Olson had likely been murdered, not killed himself, transformed the case. It became something far darker. This provided evidence of a Central Intelligence Agency willing to kill its own assets to protect operational security. But proof remained elusive. The agency maintained its position that Olson had committed suicide following an adverse reaction to LSD. The agency acknowledged the dosing was unethical and apologised for it. However, it insisted there was no evidence of foul play. Most of the officers involved included Sidney Gottlieb, Robert Lashbrook, and Harold Abramson. They had died, taking their knowledge to the grave. Gottlieb, who lived until 1999, never spoke publicly about the Olson case. He only insisted it was a tragic accident. In 2012, Eric Olson and his attorney filed a lawsuit against the federal government. They argued that the 1976 settlement had been procured through fraud. This was because the agency had concealed the true cause of death. The lawsuit sought to compel the government to release all remaining classified documents related to Frank Olson's death. It also aimed to officially acknowledge that he had been murdered. The government fought the lawsuit aggressively. At each stage, Department of Justice attorneys invoked state secrets privilege. This legal doctrine allows the government to withhold information on national security grounds. In 2013, a federal judge dismissed the case. The judge ruled that the settlement agreement signed by the Olson family in 1976 precluded further claims. Furthermore, state secrets privilege protected the remaining classified documents from disclosure. The ruling was upheld on appeal. The case was closed. However, the broader impact of the Olson case and of MKUltra generally reshaped American intelligence operations in profound ways. The Church Committee hearings from 1975 and 1976 led to sweeping reforms. These hearings were triggered in part by the MKUltra revelations. They reshaped how the Central Intelligence Agency conducted covert operations. The committee's final report, published in 14 volumes, documented decades of illegal agency activities. These included assassination plots against foreign leaders. The report also detailed drug experiments on unwitting citizens. It covered illegal surveillance of Americans. Furthermore, it revealed cooperation with organised crime and operations to destabilise democratic governments. Senator Frank Church, the committee's chairman, famously warned about the potential for tyranny. He stated that if the government ever became a tyranny, the intelligence community's technological capacity could enable it to impose total tyranny. He feared there would be no way to fight back. The reforms that followed included the creation of permanent intelligence oversight committees in Congress. They also placed restrictions on covert operations. There were new requirements for presidential findings before major operations. Prohibitions on human experiments without informed consent were also enacted. The agency's human experimentation programs were officially and permanently terminated. However, the Olson case specifically taught a darker lesson. The government's capacity for cover-up was nearly limitless. For 22 years, the agency had successfully concealed the circumstances of Frank Olson's death. Even after partial disclosure in 1975, the agency managed to control the narrative. It also limited document releases. Furthermore, it maintained that core elements of the story remained classified for national security reasons. And perhaps most disturbingly, the Olson case suggested that some secrets were considered worth killing for. The question that haunted investigators was simple. What did Frank Olson know that made him too dangerous to live? The most plausible answer relates to Central Intelligence Agency operations in Europe in the early 1950s. This answer is based on declassified documents and testimony from Fort Detrick scientists. During this period, the agency was conducting interrogations of suspected double agents and captured Soviet operatives. They used techniques that pushed far beyond legal or ethical boundaries. Some of these interrogations took place at agency black sites in Germany. These were former Nazi facilities that had been repurposed after the war. Frank Olson had visited these sites. He had expertise in aerosol delivery systems. This was relevant to certain interrogation techniques involving chemical agents. According to William Sargant, a British psychiatrist who worked with American intelligence during this period, Olson had witnessed interrogations. These resulted in deaths. These deaths were then covered up by staging accidents. If Olson had threatened to expose these operations, he would have represented an existential threat to the agency's operational security. This was especially true if his LSD-induced breakdown had loosened his conscience enough that he planned to resign and go public. The biowarfare experiments, the interrogation techniques, and the terminal medical experiments would all have been exposed. This would potentially lead to prosecutions and international scandals. It could also have dismantled the agency's covert action capabilities. In that calculus, Frank Olson's life was expendable. The technology that emerged from MKUltra was, ironically, mostly useless for its intended purpose. LSD did not create mind-controlled assassins. Truth serums remained unreliable. Memory erasure proved impossible with the tools available in the 1950s and 60s. The Central Intelligence Agency spent millions of dollars and destroyed countless lives. It did this in pursuit of capabilities that did not exist. However, the program did contribute to scientific understanding of psychoactive drugs. These understandings continue to resonate. MKUltra research helped establish the foundations of modern psychopharmacology. The agency's experiments with LSD were ethically problematic. Despite their ethical nightmares, these provided some of the earliest systematic data on the drug's effects. This data informed later research into psychedelics as therapeutic tools. In recent years, medical science has revisited the therapeutic potential of psychedelics. These are for treating post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and end-of-life anxiety. Researchers have grappled with the toxic legacy of MKUltra. The program poisoned the well. This made it nearly impossible to conduct legitimate research on these substances for decades. This was due to the associations with agency mind control experiments. Frank Olson's children, Eric, Lisa, and Nils, are now in their 70s and 80s. Eric Olson devoted much of his life to investigating his father's death. He never got the full truth. The most sensitive documents remain classified. They are locked away in agency archives that may not be opened for another generation. The Bulova watch, its mechanism frozen at 228, sits in a safe deposit box. Eric Olson has said he will donate it to the National Museum of American History when he dies. This will be along with his decades of research files. It will become an artifact of the Cold War. It is a small mechanical device that marked the moment when a scientist's life ended and a secret began. The headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency's technical services staff was located in a nondescript building in northwest Washington. Sidney Gottlieb maintained his office there during the MKUltra years. The building was demolished in 1999 to make way for a parking garage. Before the demolition, agency employees were given the opportunity to retrieve any remaining personal items from their old offices. Nothing was found in Gottlieb's former office. The space had been stripped and cleaned decades earlier, when he retired in 1973. However, in a basement storage room, workers discovered several dozen filing cabinets. These had been overlooked during the 1973 document purge. The cabinets contained financial records from MKUltra. These were not operational documents, but rather receipts, payment vouchers, and budget summaries. These documents provided the most complete picture yet of MKUltra's scope. They were released in redacted form through Freedom of Information Act request in 2001. The receipts revealed payments to dozens of universities, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and private contractors. They documented purchases of drugs, laboratory equipment, and electroshock machines. They showed payments to psychiatrists, physicians, and chemists. Many of these individuals had no idea they were working for the agency. They believed instead they were conducting legitimate academic research. This research was funded by foundations that were secretly agency fronts. The financial records also contained several entries related to Frank Olson. One document showed a payment of $150 to Dr. Harold Abramson for consultation services. This payment was on November 27, 1953. This was the day before Olson died. Another entry showed a payment to a law firm for services rendered regarding the New York incident in December 1953. A third showed a payment to the Hotel Statler for property damage and a discretionary settlement. This was in the amount of $852. That last entry was for $852 for a broken window and silence. It would be darkly funny if it were not so obscene. The epilogue to the Olson case is not a neat resolution. There is no moment of justice. There is no final revelation. There is no courtroom scene where the truth prevails. Instead, there is simply the slow accumulation of evidence. There is the gradual erosion of official lies. There is also the persistent work of one son who refused to accept the government's narrative. In the end, what Frank Olson knew may be less important. What his death reveals about the machinery of secret government is more significant. The Cold War created institutions that operated beyond oversight, beyond law, and beyond moral constraints. These institutions convinced themselves that anything was permissible in the name of national security. This included torture, experimentation, and murder. They believed the enemy was doing worse. Therefore, they thought no response was too extreme. They were often wrong about what the enemy was capable of, but they were always capable of justifying their own actions. The larger truth about MKUltra is that it was not an aberration. It was a logical extension of Cold War thinking applied to human beings instead of weapons systems. If one could race to build better missiles, why not race to build better interrogation techniques? If one could develop nerve agents and bioweapons, why not develop chemical tools for controlling minds? The same instrumental rationality that guided nuclear strategy also guided human experiments. Subjects were seen as resources to be expended in pursuit of strategic advantage. Frank Olson's body fell through the November night. It tumbled from the 10th floor of the Hotel Statler toward the concrete below. His Bulova watch counted off the final seconds. This is the image that captures something essential about the Cold War's moral logic. A man was reduced to a problem. This problem was solved by defenestration. His death was concealed by paperwork and classified stamps. It was also concealed by the vast machinery of state secrecy. The files remain mostly sealed. The truth remains mostly hidden. And in a safe deposit box in Maryland, a stopped watch marks the exact moment when the falling began. Here is the final irony. The Central Intelligence Agency never succeeded in erasing memory with LSD. This was despite thousands of experiments and decades of research. The agency destroyed countless lives in the process. However, the Central Intelligence Agency never developed the ability to reliably erase what someone knew or had seen. The agency could only use cruder methods of memory erasure. These included a hotel window, a long fall, and a watch stopped at 2:28. Some memories can only be erased by eliminating the person who holds them.